Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. On the misty heights of San Francisco, where houses look more like works of art than places to live, an ultramodern villa stood surrounded by silence and solitude. Ethan Carter, a tech genius and respected Silicon Valley mogul, lived there like a king locked away in his own palace. Behind the immaculate walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the bay, he had built a cold, orderly, almost unreal world, a place where everything seemed under control, except for the essentials. At 38, Ethan embodied success in its most brilliant form. Investor, inventor, and beloved speaker. His company, Neuron, specializing in medical AI, had saved thousands of lives thanks to revolutionary predictive diagnostics. He became a legend during his lifetime. More grief does not respect CVs or trophies. For 3 years, the tragic death of his wife, Emily, in a plane crash, had left a huge void. She was returning from a humanitarian conference in Geneva, eager to be reunited with their daughter. The plane would never land. Since that day, Ethan had lived half-heartedly. He had drowned himself in algorithms and fundraising, in calculations, in decisions with high global impact. Both had no longer learned to live with a whole heart. His daughter, Grace, 6 years old, was his most precious possession, and at the same time his most feared. She was so much like him. The same sharp gaze, the same precocious intelligence. But she also carried in her silences a pain that he recognized. She drew blank faces, often looking at the door as if waiting for someone. She asked questions Ethan didn't have the strength to hear. Why isn't Mom coming back? Why do you always come home so late? He loved her, madly, but he no longer knew how to be a father. So, as one delegates a function, he asked his assistant to hire a nanny. Discreet, experienced, qualified. He hadn't even asked to see a photo. He just wanted that someone fill that void he couldn't fill. It was barely 5 o'clock in the morning when Autumn Williams got off the bus, his hands clutching a battered suitcase with a creaking handle. The streets of Pacific Heights were silent, bathed in that blue light the sky takes on before dawn. The air was humid, almost sharp. She inhaled deeply. Her gait was slow, calculated, as if each step brought her closer to a world she no longer wanted to belong to. She wore a simple coat, worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen miles. Nothing betrayed the inner hurricane that inhabited her. She stopped in front of an elegant black gate, framed by perfectly trimmed hedges. Beyond, one could make out the bright, white house, its large windows opening like closed eyes onto a glass dream. And there, in this precious silence, the past hit her hard. For it was here that lived Ethan Carter, the man she had loved madly, the man who had betrayed her without violence, but with the resignation of a coward. Autumn and Ethan had met at the University of Stanford, in a cross-seminar between literature and cognitive sciences. She, a brilliant student of African-American literature, passionate about James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, a scholarship holder, waitress in the evenings to pay for her books. He, an arrogant young prodigy, from a wealthy and conservative Californian family, already destined for great things. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did. Their story began in secret. A few glances, a shared project, nights spent talking about identity, freedom, ambition. They had loved each other in the interstices between codes and traditions, with the intensity of those who know the outside world will give them no chance. Then they finally faced the gaze. They loved each other in broad daylight. But the illusion did not last. One evening, Ethan was summoned to the family home, a mansion with values as rigid as the paintings that decorated its walls. There, his father had told him, "You choose this girl, you lose everything. Money, contacts, inheritance, career. And if you choose to leave her, we will open all doors for you." He had selected. Autumn hadn't screamed. She hadn't begged. She had left. More, she was not alone. 2 months later, a pregnancy test changed her life. And she decided to keep quiet. Out of pride, out of dignity, out of a sense of self-protection. She had raised their daughter alone, moving from city to city, working in educational centers and private families. She had never asked for a cent. She didn't want anyone to think she had come to take advantage. But today, as Grace was about to start school, and she was asking more and more questions about her father, Autumn had wanted to know. To know who this man had become. If he was capable of giving what he had once been unable to offer. She hadn't warned. She wanted to observe him. To see how he treated her child, their child. Day was just breaking over the Californian heights, bathing the white facade of the Carter Villa in a golden light. The air was fresh, quiet, barely disturbed by the rustling of leaves. Ethan, like every morning, walked towards the front door, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. He wore a light linen shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, with the nonchalant but precise look of men who rule the world from dawn. When he opened the door, time stood still. His gaze fell on her, and everything changed. Autumn? The mug shook slightly in his hand. One more second, and he would have dropped it. His jaw tensed. His pupils dilated. Everything about him, usually so perfectly in control, wavered. She was there, Autumn, before him, after 9 years of silence. Still as straight, still as calm. Her face had changed, matured, but her eyes, those eyes, remained the same. Unfathomable, burning, lucid. She held his gaze unwaveringly. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. I'm here for Grace." A neutral tone, almost professional, but the first name, spoken like an insurmountable barrier, cut off any attempt. Ethan wanted to speak, call him by his first name, say he was sorry, that he had tried to understand, that he had changed. But he did nothing, because he understood. He understood in Autumn's silence what he had destroyed, and that the past cannot be erased with a word. Before he could react, a soft voice sounded behind him. "Dad? Is she the lady who came for me?" Grace appeared in the doorway, her hair still tangled, her stuffed animal against her. When she saw Autumn, she lit up. "Are you the new nanny?" she asked hopefully. Autumn looked down at the girl, and for the first time in a long time, her mask cracked. An immense tenderness, mixed with sadness and love, crossed her gaze. "Yes, sweetie, it's me." Ethan watched, frozen. He saw his daughter approach this seemingly unknown woman, who seemed to recognize her. He saw Grace's small arms wrap around Autumn's waist, fearless, as if an ancient bond was being reawakened. He felt a strange thing in his chest, gratitude mixed with unexplained fear. Why did this woman, whom he hadn't seen for almost a decade, already seem to be part of his daughter's heart? The following days were a strange mixture of embarrassment, beauty, and quiet tension. Autumn didn't talk about their past. She didn't ask. She cared for Grace with firm gentleness, infinite patience, and almost uncanny intuition. She knew what to say when the girl was scared, how to calm her nightmares, how to make her laugh with simple words. She knew how to comfort her, and that upset Ethan. He found himself watching them play, listening to their peals of laughter in the garden. And every time he saw Autumn take Grace's hand, something inside him was breaking. It was like looking at an old painting whose origin you had forgotten, but which you felt deep inside. He didn't understand why this image seemed to him so natural, so right. And then, sometimes, at night, alone in his office, he would see Autumn's look again when she had said, "I'm here for Grace." It wasn't that of an employee. It was that of a mother. And this idea, as insane as it seemed, never left him. What he didn't know yet was that Grace was his daughter. Their daughter. By the time Autumn became pregnant, Ethan was already gone, broken by family blackmail, cut off from the world by a web of control woven by his parents. She had tried to reach him, but every call, every letter, every message had been intercepted. Until the day she realized. He knew nothing, and maybe didn't want to know. So she had decided to keep the child alone. She had made it through the early years without help, working multiple jobs, refusing pity, building around Grace a cocoon of dignity, love, and truth. But it was an incomplete truth. And then, a few months earlier, life had changed again. And cancer detected too late. The fight had begun, brutal, exhausting. The treatments were heavy, uncertain. And Autumn found herself facing a fear greater than her own, that his daughter has no one left. So she made the difficult decision to come back, to observe Ethan, to see if he had become the man he had claimed to be in the media, not the tech genius, not the millionaire, but the father. She had accepted the nanny job, not to work, but to prepare the ground, to tell him the truth, and make sure that if she had to leave, Grace wouldn't be alone. The days stretched out, and Ethan could no longer sleep. He spent his nights working, but his mind always wandered to the living room, where Grace's peals of laughter still echoed, to the kitchen, where Autumn made him hot chocolate when she thought he hadn't eaten, towards the garden, where he sometimes watched them, invisible, her and her daughter, his daughter, turning on the grass, hands joined, as in an ancient dance. What troubled him most was not only Autumn's presence, nor the new tenderness he felt for her. It was the evidence which slowly crept into his mind. Each day, Grace looked more like Autumn, in the way she frowned when she was thinking, in the way she turned her head when she laughed, in his lively intelligence and his meaningful silences. Ethan began to doubt what he had always believed, and this idea, at first crazy, became an obsession. That evening, he was alone in his office, a dim light illuminating the walls covered with books and technological plans. Looking for a USB key, he opened a drawer he never used and came across an old college photo. It was them, him and Autumn. He looked at her for a long time. He saw himself again, young, carefree, in love. She, with her lively gaze, her hand on his arm, like something obvious at his side. A lump formed in his throat. He picked up his phone and frantically searched through the documents the nanny agency had sent him. But there was no trace, no number, no full name. Autumn had erased everything. Purposely. For what? He stood up without thinking, driven by an uncontrollable force. He walked briskly down the silent corridor, stopping in front of the guest room where she was staying. He hesitated, then knocked gently. The door opened slowly. Autumn stood there, in a simple dress, her hair undone, looking tired, but still straight, dignified. Ethan? He looked at her. For a long time. Too long. Then, in an almost broken voice, "Why did you come back?" She didn't answer right away. She lowered her eyes and inhaled slowly, as if gathering the strength of a decade. "Because you should have known the truth. Because I couldn't carry it alone anymore." He opened his mouth slightly, confused. She continued, her eyes bright but determined. "When you left, I was already pregnant. I tried to tell you. I wrote. I called. I begged. But your family had already locked everything away. They intercepted my letters, my messages. I even tried to reach out to you, but one of your uncles told me you'd forgotten about me, that you already had another life." Ethan took a step back. He blanched. His lips trembled. "Do you mean that Grace is my daughter?" She nodded. A silent tear rolled down her cheek. "Yes, she is our girl." Silence fell. Thick. Immense. Ethan staggered, placed a hand against the wall. Then he fell to his knees, unable to stand under the weight of what he had just learned. He looked up at her, devastated. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" His voice broke on the last word. He was crying, not like a public figure losing control, but like a man who had just lost 9 years of his own life. Autumn slowly knelt beside him. She placed a hand on his chest, where his heart was pounding. "Because I was afraid. Because I didn't want your family to do that. Grace, what they did to me. I wanted to give him the right to exist without having to apologize. And I wanted to make sure that if I had to leave, you would be ready." He looked at her, overwhelmed. Everything inside him was cracking. His certainties, his self-image, his regrets, his loss. Then, in a breath, "Are you going to leave?" She didn't answer. And that's when he understood that this moment changed everything. Ethan changed overnight. The man in a hurry, always between 2 flights, 2 calls, 2 projects, abandoned his travels like one abandons an old skin. His diary, once saturated, suddenly became an empty notebook, where each page was now devoted to a single thing: Grace. He dropped her off at school in the morning, hand in hand. He waited at the exit, a smile in his eyes, eager to hear her tell him about her day. He read her stories at night, tucked her in himself, sometimes clumsily, but always with his heart. And when he looked at her now, it was different. It was no longer the look of an adult softened by the innocence of a child. It was that of a father, overwhelmed by the discovery of a love he was unaware of, in which he was catching up on second by second. With Autumn, things were slower, more fragile, but real. Ethan didn't hold it against her. On the contrary, he looked at her with a kind of silent admiration. She had raised their daughter alone, in the shadows. She had held firm. And despite the betrayal of those around her, despite the loneliness, she had loved Grace with absolute tenderness. But as they began to relearn how to talk to each other, how to find each other again, another truth emerged, even more cruel. Autumn was sick. Breast cancer. Detected late. At first, she hadn't said anything. She didn't want to mix her suffering with this emerging peace. But Ethan, who had become attentive to her every silence, quickly understood. And this time, he wouldn't run away. He mobilized everything he had. Contacts, doctors, specialists. He found her a dedicated medical team, a gentle nurse who came every morning. But above all, the rest. He was there every day. During chemo sessions, he held her hand. He sat her on the couch, made soups she struggled to swallow, and fell asleep in the armchair next to her when her fever rose. The months passed. Harsh, silent at times, but full of a new love. An adult love, forged through hardship, forgiveness, and presence. Then one morning the sky looked bluer. Autumn got up alone. She walked to the garden. Her scarf was flying in the wind, and on her face there way soft light. The tests confirmed it. Remission. This word, which they did not dare to pronounce, resounded like a song. And that afternoon, as the cherry trees bloomed in the garden and the golden April light bathed the house, Grace ran between her two parents, laughing heartily. Her hair fluttered, her arms waved, and in her eyes shone the pure joy of a child who feels that all is well. Ethan approached Autumn. He took her in his arms, gently, as if he were enveloping her in everything he had never been able to say. He looked at her for a long time. In his eyes, there was no longer any guilt or regret, just the certainty of a man who had understood, perhaps too late, but who was ready to repair, to love, to stay. Stay, Autumn, he said in a trembling voice. Not as a nanny, not as a guest. Like you. She smiled, tears in her eyes, but she stood. We'll see, but I'm here. For Grace. And for you. In a small bookstore in Brooklyn, a book sat in the window. Simple cover. Title, What We Don't Tell Fathers. Author, Autumn Williams. Inside, a series of poignant, intimate stories about love, motherhood, enforced silence, rage, forgiveness, and the courage of single women. But above all, an open letter to absent, lost, prevented fathers, or found ones. On the last page, a simple, handwritten dedication. To Ethan Carter, the father our daughter deserved, and the man I've always loved.